My name is Elizabeth Bowen, and this presentation will investigate a study by Cheshin, Raffaelli, and Boss that looks at the effect of emotion and behavior in the communication of virtual teams. To begin, the authors present the emotion contagion phenomenon, which proposes that emotion has social power. In other words, that emotion can be passed from one person to another. It says that this occurs because when a person feels an emotion, they act in a certain way, and that these behavioral cues are picked up on by a receiver, who in turn mimics these behaviors and comes to feel these emotions for themselves. Because emotion contagion relies on the receiver observing behaviors in the sender, the authors of this study question whether or not emotion contagion can occur in virtual teams where communication relies solely by written means. They propose 4 different hypotheses. The first is that emotion contagion will take place in virtual teams, and that this emotion contagion will include both positive and negative emotions of anger and happiness. Second, that when a team perceives resoluteness in the written communication of a team member, they will attribute anger to this team member. And third, that when the team perceives flexibility in the written communication of this team member, that they will attribute happiness to that team member. And lastly, that a mismatch between emotion and behavior will lead to anger within the team. So what this means is that when the written communication expresses say anger, but the behavior that the teammates feel is expressed in the communication is flexibility, which should relate to happiness, that this mismatch between the emotion and behavior will lead to anger. So to investigate this idea, the researchers recruited university students and divided their participants into teams of 4. In the experimental condition, 3 of the group members were participants and 1 was a Confederate. And in the control condition, all 4 members of the team were participants. So what the researchers asked the team to do was to pretend that they each were in charge of a manufacturing company that produced a specific shape, and that their goal was to sell their shapes to team members and buy team members' shapes in turn, so that they could fill the orders of customers who were looking for a variety of shapes. So this required a negotiation simulation where the participants used written communication to try and negotiate this deal with their team members. The researchers used a 2x2 experimental design, and specifically what they manipulated was a behavior of the Confederate in their written communication. So in one condition, they manipulated the emotion of the Confederate's written message. So the message either conveyed happiness or anger. So the Confederate might say something like, "It was a pleasure doing business with you," and this was supposed to communicate that they were happy in their written message. So there were 2 different levels to this condition. In the second condition, the researchers manipulated the behavior of the Confederate. So what this meant was within the written message, they wanted the teammates to perceive the sender of the message, the Confederate, as expressing either resoluteness or flexibility. So resoluteness would be when the Confederate was trying to buy a piece for the lowest amount and sell their pieces for a high profit. Whereas flexibility was when the Confederate would sell as long as they didn't experience a profit, and would be much more flexible in buying for a higher price from the other teammates. So what the researchers measured were the self-reports of the teammates of the Confederates on their positive and negative affect, both before the simulation took place and afterwards. In addition, they also looked at how the teammates rated each other and what they thought their teammates' positive and negative affect was. In addition, the researchers pulled together these ratings from each individual to get a measure and a sense of the team emotion. And lastly, they looked at the interaction between each pair in the team. And they were specifically looking at the number of messages with a positive emphasis or a negative emphasis and how many communications in total took place. So what did they find? The researchers found that all of their hypotheses were supported. So to begin, that emotion contagion did take place. So what this means is that in groups where the Confederate acted angry, the teammates reported significantly higher negative affect than in groups where the Confederate acted happy. In contrast, in groups where the Confederate acted happy, the teammates reported significantly higher positive affect in relation to the groups where the Confederate acted angry. Not only did this hold for their individual ratings, but also for the overall rating of team emotion. So teams where Confederates acted angry had more negative affect, and teams where the Confederate acted happy had more positive affect. In addition, they also found that when the Confederates exhibited resoluteness in their written communications, their teammates perceived them as angrier, and when the teammates perceived the Confederates' message as more flexible, that the teammates attributed happiness to the Confederate. And lastly, they also found support for their hypothesis that a mismatch between the emotion and the behavior would lead to greater anger in the team. So specifically in congruent cases, so when there was an expression of anger and there was the resolute behavior. In general, these congruent conditions led to less negative affect compared to incongruent conditions, so when there was an expression of anger and a behavior of flexibility. And in fact, this condition was the one that led to the greatest amount of negative affect in the team. Implications. So there are very important implications from this research for a broad range of teams. And what I mean by this is that email has become a very popular form of communication. It's very useful for sending a message very quickly to a very large number of people, which is particularly important when working with teams, to have that ability to get your message out there quickly. So emails are very important for all different types of teams. In the business world, transnational businesses and teams are becoming even more common, and they rely on the written communication to really keep their day-to-day interactions going when they can't necessarily meet with each other in a board meeting. Also, emails are really very important for sports teams, just to communicate regarding practice times, as well as different positive or negative things that are going on within the team environment and how that's going to be handled. So really the findings of this study that look at how emotion and behaviors are communicated through written means really applies to the use of emails within both business teams and sports teams. Next, there's an implication for communication etiquette. So since this study shows that emotions can be transferred through written communication, it emphasizes the importance of perhaps sharing your positive emotions with your teammates and kind of garnering that feeling throughout the whole team. But specifically, if you have a negative emotion that isn't relevant to the team, that it's due to some outside event or source that took place in someone's own personal life, to try and be very careful not to have this communicated in the written message, because it can be picked up on by team members and negatively influence their emotion and potentially their behaviors. Lastly, there's an implication for effective communication. So what we know is that since emotion and behavior send messages through written communication, that if you are trying to get a certain response out of your teammates, it could be very important to act in certain ways. So specifically with regards to this study, they found that acting in a flexible way had the teammates attribute happiness to that person. In turn, the idea of emotion contagion would say that the teammates would also have an experience of happiness themselves, and perhaps might act flexibly back towards the sender of that communication, which could be very important in a negotiation situation. So overall implications. There are a number of strengths with this study, but there are also some important limitations to keep in mind. So one strength is that this was the first study to look at the possibility of emotion contagion occurring in written communication. And as I said, since written communication is becoming so much more common and popular as a means to communicate within teams, it's very important to understand exactly how emotion and how people perceive behaviors from the sender, how these two things can influence a team that isn't meeting face-to-face. Second, there was a control condition within the study, and this is important because it allows the experimenters to say that a result was specifically due to their manipulation. So if there was no control condition, they wouldn't be able to say whether or not perhaps an increase in positive affect was due to positive communications within the team members, or if perhaps teams just feel better when they're successful in negotiating, and that's the actual result for the positive affect. So it really helps them attribute the causes to their manipulation. And lastly, they had rewards for individual and team performance. And this is specifically important so that the team, who consisted of members who hadn't worked together previously and weren't actually members of a real virtual team, that they would work towards the common good because they're being rewarded for the overall goal of fulfilling customer orders within the team in addition to just their own orders. One significant limitation involves the external validity of the study. As I said before, the team was not an actual virtual team that had worked together previously and were really only brought together for this experiment. And this could have an effect in that real virtual teams are kind of used to they have a past experience in how the members of the team act, and they have an idea of how to perceive different communications, and this might have an effect on how they interpret emotion in written messages, but this couldn't take place in the virtual team of the study. In addition, there was no way to see if the emotion and behavior perceived in the written communication had an effect on performance. This was, as the author said, just too far outside of the scope of their study, but should be considered in future investigations. In case you would like to look at the study yourself and kind of get more into the specifics, here is the reference.